sit in that seat. Let's get to the slide. It should have a countdown right now, though. Should be doing. There it is. Boom. Can you put on the sound and make sure you can hear? Can you hear anything?
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
You can hear it? I have a headphone. You can hear it, but it's not. You can hear it from there? Okay, yeah. Yep, there's just a delay, that's all. Okay, so you are. I just heard her talk just now, so. Okay.
Perfect. All right.
And then let me start that over to you, so. You want to do it so there's a picture. Should be something.
Okay. All right. All right. Hello, I'm Jenn Hill. I'm with the Citizen Utility Board of Michigan, and I'm here today. We're going to talk to you about the changing nature of the power systems electricity and heating and gas that we use in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I really appreciate the folks at Campfire CoWorks hosting me here today to make this possible, and the Conservation Data Lab, which is a co-sponsor of the event today and helps talk through some of these important ideas about how do you understand when something like these technology changes are happening, how do you help visualize and explain those ideas? So I'm going to jump right into it, and we'll look first actually back in time. This first slide has images of really why the Upper Peninsula is so critical to understand our energy system in the whole entire United States. And that's, of course, because of our copper. And so the picture there on the left are the pudding stones that not pudding stones, the pounding stones that the Anishinaabe used in order to meld the copper that was, of course, here naturally. And so, we have been using the resources of our land for generations and generations and generations. And it's just incredible how that this one region of the United States has been so critical to us having electricity across the entire country. And then the picture on the upper right is Quincy Mine in Hancock. And the folks were at lunch, and they came together and took this picture back 100 years ago. And again, to take the copper now out of the ground instead of just on the surface. And then the photo on the bottom is a dam being constructed in Crystal Falls, Michigan, that is still in use today. So again, the history of our area, the Upper Peninsula, literally the copper that made electricity possible in the rest of our country came from here. And we are pretty thrifty folks and resourceful folks here in the Upper Peninsula, and we are still using structures that were built 100 years ago. But the consequence of that, of us being first with some of these raw materials and important structures, is that now, 100 years later, a lot of those systems are sort of reached their natural end. And so the question is, what comes next? And so I want to show you first, right here in Marquette, what we have is we had 2 coal-fired power generation stations that generated electricity for a very long time using coal primarily from Wyoming that came over on the boats from Duluth, but also coal from the Appalachian region in the southern United States. And each one of those loads of coal here at the end in the 2000s would cost over $1 million to pay for that coal. It just became very, very expensive, and to keep those plants operating. So we were moving on to other systems. And I want to make clear here that my experience and expertise is really more about the whole system and the policy. And there's a lot of good folks who've worked for their entire careers to make sure that we have safe and reliable energy in the Upper Peninsula. And those utilities, transmission companies, power line workers, the folks answering the phone in the offices, they've been working really hard and doing a great job of keeping the systems that we have running. But again, there are changes coming at a large scale in business, in politics, and of course the problems of climate change that mean that we are moving our power generation to other sources. So I'm going to share next with you the most important thing that I learned, which was told to me at a meeting at Michigan Tech back in 2014, when the Upper Peninsula was facing a situation where the 300 residents of the UP were going to have to pay between $60 and $100 million to keep our old system operating, which is there's 3 things in the energy system: the physics of moving around electricity, the politics of who decides, and then the business models of how we move those resources through the system. And the trick is that in that system, not one can outweigh the other. There's going to come a point where one of the three is going to push and pull back. So you have to have all three things, not exactly in balance, they're never really in balance, but they're going to keep moving around. And they keep changing, in particular as our technology changes. And so if you think about the cell phone, we've only had a cell phone for about 15 years, the really smart ones. The iPhone came out 15 years ago. And think about how much has changed in that 15 years. That's part of how I think about what's happening in our energy system. The technology changes, and then you start to have this push and pull between the politics of who decides, the business flows of how does it make sense? How do we even get coal from Wyoming to the shores of Marquette? And how do we get the technology to move the copper from here to the rest of the country, for example? So where I'm going to go next, so that fundamental concept of politics, physics, and business, we're going to come back to it again and again today. So I showed you a picture of those coal plants. Those coal plants are now shut down, and that by the end of this year, by the end of 2021, they're both going to be torn down, and they will be gone from the shores of Marquette. That technology has served its purpose and has moved on. So where are we today? Well, this image was pulled down off the internet yesterday. It is a map of the power generation, so the source of energy that's being planned by businesses and utilities and governments for our next 40 years. What do you see on that map? It's mostly yellow. That yellow, those yellow dots, that's solar power. So this is businesses putting a stake in, and they put us. There's a system that I'm going to explain where they apply to be part of our electric grid, and you can see that there are hundreds more solar projects planned for the entire Midwest than there are the other sources of fuel. So it's a business decision these days to move into solar. Now, I also blew it up so you can see our region in particular, and you'll see that up here it's also true that solar is going to be the primary generation going forward. We also have, that were built in the last few years, natural gas plants. And we actually also have hydro. In fact, about 10 to 15%, depending on how you measure things, to even 20% when you, including the Sioux Locks, of the power generated in the Upper Peninsula is generated with water energy, with dams. So, and that, going back to that image of Crystal Falls, that's been in place for a long time, and we've maintained it over the years, and it's one of the ways that we keep the lights on here. But going forward, as you can see, solar is really, not just because government's pushing it, but because businesses are choosing to invest in solar. So I talked about the grid. So, our electricity really began about 120 years ago, 140 years ago in the United States. And again, because we had the copper up here to then help wire the rest of the country. And that grid in our area is the Mid-Continent Independent Services Organization, MISO. And then it's divided into regions. And you'll see that the Upper Peninsula, the purple area there, is connected directly to Wisconsin, but is not, in fact, except for one line, connected to the Lower Peninsula. And that just reflects the reality of 100 years ago, when it was so much easier to connect to Wisconsin when you're running wires. And there's a lot of power generation in the Green Bay, Milwaukee areas, for example. And so these we're part of the Zone 2 grid, and that is really the basis by which a lot of decisions are made. So back to that politics question, and business resource model piece, that we're directly connected to Wisconsin, but of course we're under the laws of Michigan. So one other fundamental concept I want to run through around power generation is that when you go to the wall and you flip that switch, 99% of the time the lights are going to turn on. We have developed an incredible system in the United States that has really very, very reliable power. Now, that said, there are certainly power outages that can last from a flicker to what happened 2 years ago here in the UP, in Marquette County in particular, where we had a really bad wet snowstorm at Thanksgiving. And I know folks who lost power for 100 hours at Thanksgiving. So the way that we've dealt with that in the current system is that we have redundant power. So we have multiple lines serving areas. We make sure that everything is built at a little over capacity so that when things are not working well, there's extra room to take up the slack. Now, where we're moving to in the new system with solar, because of course the sun doesn't shine all the time, is what's called intermittent power. And when we have intermittent power, that's also, sort of the situation we have now, where the power is not on all the time. There are times, and in fact, here in Marquette again, a story a few years ago where a squirrel chewed through the wrong cable and turned off power to Northern Michigan University. This actually happened. But that's of course an unplanned and unexpected event. With intermittent power and solar power, you can plan for when there's not going to be as much generation. We certainly know when the sun's going to rise and the sun's going to set, and we can know how much wind is going to be projected for at least 12 to 24 hours in advance, and we're getting better at that all the time. So the move from a redundant backup system to an intermittent system, where we then take into account things like time of use, and we bring more storage, i.e. with batteries, onto the system, so that we can store this solar power that's generated and then use it at other times of day. The way that, the switches and inverters and the electronics, again, think about your phone system. And folks might remember when we only had really one long distance phone company. We had that big centralized system. And now we have a system where we have lots of different providers, and we have cell phones and we have landlines, and it's gotten all broken up and it's going in lots of different directions. That is similar to in that we will have the ability to measure what's going on minute by minute on our power system, and using that information to help manage, is it a windy day, is it a sunny day? That technology is going to go a long way to make sure that we can use this free resource of power, because of course wind and sun is free, but we do have to manage it using technology. So I'm now going to move into how the system works in the Upper Peninsula. You've gotten those basic concepts. And what we have in the counties of the UP are a number of different utilities that basically arose from the mines and the mills that, again, were built over 100 years ago. And the ownership structure, the business model, back to that business thing, is really important to understand. There are the ones that are owned by government, by the cities, where you're basically paying your taxes, or you're paying a bill that goes to a government, that where the people you elect and vote for are the people who are the ultimate deciders of how that place works. In addition, being a really rural area, we have rural electric co-ops that were set up during the Great Depression, where members then vote and control. They're locally controlled as well, and you can vote for the board of directors. And then the third one system we have is what's called investor-owned utilities, where they are private companies, just like a car company or a clothing manufacturer, and they're shareholders or they're owned by a private equity firm. And those companies are regulated to get the right to have the monopoly by a group called the Michigan Public Service Commission. So it turns out that, back to the principles of three, who decides depends on what kind of utility is serving you. And in the UP, we have all three different kinds of utilities. And then where they're located is really quite the patchwork. My mom quilts, but I don't know if she would make a quilt that looks like the utility map of the Upper Peninsula. And it reflects, again, the mines and the mills and the work that was being done in this area 100 years ago. And you'll see downstate, however, there's on the more rural fringes, there's a bunch of different ones, but there's primarily only three. And those three are regulated by that Michigan Public Service Commission again. And so our system is fundamentally different. And I was a member of a group called the UP Energy Task Force, and our number one recommendation for how to help the UP move forward is to have the utilities figure out ways to work together. With the coming changes in technology and the need for resources to pay for those changes, it's really a good idea for us to work together. Now, they do have that capacity in several different ways, but working together across the entire UP has not always been the case, and we came out recommending that we really should do that. And one of the things that's happened over time is, unfortunately, the rates that those different utilities charge varies quite a bit. And so you'll see the black dots are Upper Peninsula utilities. The green X is the average rate across all of Michigan, upper and lower. And you'll see that we have a few below the line, but most of our utility providers, unfortunately, are above that average. And it's not just because we're more rural, because there are parts of, Lower Peninsula that are pretty rural too. If you go over to the northeastern Lower Peninsula, and it doesn't look that different from the UP, certainly where the population patterns are. There's some other things that have happened up in the UP, particularly our reliance on industry to have built the system, and then as industry has left the area, the residential ratepayers have been left having to carry the load. And so I'm going to go back. On the right there is an image of a power line pole, and it's a report that the group I'm part of, the Citizen Utility Board of Michigan, is now releasing on an annual basis that compares the different utilities in Michigan and their reliability and their cost. And unfortunately, Michigan utilities statewide, compared to the rest of the country, don't do a great job on reliability. So we're paying for electricity, but it's not always there, right? That squirrel takes things down, but then also after storms, we do not have a very good record of how long it takes for us to repair and restore power compared to even places like Minnesota or Maine, climates similar to ours. So we are publishing this data to just make it known what the numbers are, and then hoping that folks will take that information and look at them and maybe there's ways we can improve our operations so that this will become, that folks can know that the power will be turned back on sooner. We don't have those 100-hour power outages. Now, I'm going to move in to, again, the generation question. This map shows the solar potential. And again, back to that idea of where are we moving to, and what's the system going to look like in the future? And in particular, I want to call your attention to the fact that, the Upper Peninsula is green, and green is okay. Of course, red has tremendous solar potential down in the southwest where it's sunny all the time. We certainly have clouds being in the Great Lakes. However, you can look on the right is the green and yellow is Spain, and the purple one is Germany. And those two countries are actually further north on the planet than we are, and particularly Germany has much less solar potential than we do. We have a solar potential that's closer to Spain in terms of because of the hours of daylight that we have, the length of the day, and how much cloud cover we have. And so though Germany is able to produce on a regular basis 30% of all of its energy needs for a very industrialized country in a day, 30% of it's coming from renewables. And many other countries in Europe are approaching that as well. So what I want you to understand from this map is, yeah, it's cloudy up here, and yeah, it snows up here, but actually the technology is so much better now with solar panels and with wind that we really can use these systems. And in fact, Europe is doing a great job at it, and we can do that here too. And so just to further make the point about wind, this is the map of the wind potential for Michigan. And what's really interesting about wind, and I know that a lot of folks see those turbines and they think, oh, I don't want that where I live. But here's the thing. They're cheaper. They're a lot cheaper. Because you put one of those towers up and you start those turbines spinning, and you can power thousands of homes now with one turbine. And we don't have the conflicts, the need to bring energy sources from other parts of the world to our shores. We can actually generate our energy locally. And I know it's different, and I know that there are folks who are very concerned that I don't want that by my house. Now, but there are also tax benefits where these folks pay a lot of taxes, and so folks get new school buses, they get new police cars. There's ways of doing the project where communities can choose, well, I don't want to be a place where they generate electricity. Okay, then how are you going to buy your electricity? Because you're going to have to buy it from somewhere. And if you want to generate it on your own, here are some options and what they could look like. So that conversation generally happens at the Planning Commission in Michigan, county and city and township planning commissions. And there are a lot of resources now about if you want to make that choice and how to do that, you can get in touch with the Michigan State University Extension Service, the MSU Extension Service. They have a lot of terrific resources. Because a big change is we can now choose, do we want to produce power in our own communities? Because we can. Or do we want to be a place that buys the power from somewhere else? And another thing we can do here in the UP is we could put those the solar panels and the wind turbine, the wind towers, on places that have already been used. So a group called the Michigan Energy Options, which has an office here in Marquette, has mapped what's called brownfield. So basically the old mine sites or other places where there's been industrial activity over the years, already might even have electricity lines running to the location. Let's put the power where it makes the most sense. Let's not cut down, trees that aren't due to be cut down. Let's put the power where we already have resources, the electric lines, and where we've already done some industrial activity, so we're reusing an industrial site. And in fact, down in Dickinson County, they're doing that on some land that's now owned by DNR that used to be a mine, and figuring out how to generate power that would actually power thousands of homes using an old mine site and solar panels. So, in addition, I want to also again emphasizing the idea that the renewable transition is here right now, is that the biggest companies in our economy have switched over to renewable energy. Not because just entirely that they want to be seen as green, but because it is cheaper in the long run to use an energy source where you don't have to buy fuel every month. You can, the sun is free, the wind is free, and so everyone from Amazon to Lansing Board of Power and Light have invested in these tools to generate electricity that a solar panel will maintain its ability to generate electricity for a good 20 to 25 years. So we buy it, we set it up, and then over time, we're replacing a switch, an inverter, some cabling, but that facility will last for decades. And so it's a real advantage to think about how do we set up a system where we put it in and we install it, but then we don't have to keep pulling in resources from out of state, but we just use what's here. And to further go down that road, of course, you've probably heard of Tesla, the new motor company that is making batteries and making cars. And they in fact have batteries that can also go on the wall of your home so that you could literally plug your car into your house, and if you had solar on your house, you could be generating all the energy you need to live in your house and to have transportation. Sounds like science fiction? It's happening right now, today, and we could do it here in the UP. And it's not just Tesla. There is also many other companies getting into this space. For example, all of the automakers have committed to only making electric-powered vehicles in 15 years. So remember when I said that the iPhone has only been around for 15 years? In 15 years, we're only going to have electric-powered vehicles. And again, because of physics, because of politics, and because of business. And so those three things are interacting to move us into this new system. Now, if you've ever looked at the history of automaking, there were a lot of electric car makers 100 years ago, too. Well, not a lot, but there were certainly people interested in making that happen. They just couldn't quite figure out how to get the batteries to work, right? They were too heavy, too big. It was too much to move around the battery on the cars that they had at the time. Battery technology is amazing. We have these tiny little batteries in headphones now and cell phones. That leap in technology is bringing us a future where with the orange ones, those are trucks, you'll be able to plug in your power tools in the back of your pickup and run your power tools off the back of your pickup. Those cars are going to go on, or those trucks are going to go on sale the end of this year, beginning of next year. So again, we're right in the middle of this change. And so it's happening all around us, and it might seem really sudden, but know that there's been 20 years of research behind making some of this stuff happen. So bringing it back, we went big, we're bringing it back to the UP. I mentioned I was on the UP Energy Task Force. These images are of us meeting in Hancock on top and in the Sioux on the bottom. Before COVID, we were meeting every month in different parts of the UP to talk about all these changes. The recommendations that we came up with, which remember started with let's all work together because we have a lot of work to do and I think we can do more together, get further faster, can be found. So the recommendations are all in a report up on a website, and I will be sharing that information. We worked together for almost a year and a half and we heard from all the different players in the Upper Peninsula about what's happening now and where we're going to be going in the future. And so one of the things that we identified is people are concerned about propane. A lot of people use, we found that about 20% of the UP, now this includes seasonal homes too, so this is camps as well as, but there are a lot of people who also live full-time on propane. There are many sources of propane in the Midwest, and so the building rail, which would bring jobs and investment to our communities, and having more trucking would provide access to propane. And in addition, our propane system in our country is pretty robust. And yes, we've had problems now with pipelines, but we do have the ability to bring in resources from inside the United States and not have to rely on it to come from other countries to keep our power going on the propane system. But in addition to that, there's new tools coming. So there's something in particular called a heat pump. So heat pumps, I had that question up about how many do you have in your house. If you have a refrigerator in your house or a freezer, that's a heat pump. So we already have heat pumps. And what heat pumps do is instead of making heat, or like what happens in an air conditioner, it's similar, but you don't have to burn something to make heat. You can instead take the difference between the outside and the inside of a house and move heat with an electric motor. So we can have electric powered homes. And those electric powered homes, again, mean you don't have to rely necessarily on somebody bringing you fuel. You can have it on a wire. Now, we've talked about how squirrels will gnaw through cables, so every system has to have a backup, has to have something else in place. It has to have a little bit of extra capacity. But the key thing to remember with heat pumps is that they move the heat around. Now, for a long time, again, changing technologies, things are getting smaller, more compact as we've gotten more and more better at electronics. Heat pumps were kind of noisy and they didn't work so well in the cold. Well, the good news is they're now down to solidly -10. So that'll work in a lot of places in the UP, not all, but many. And there's also now the ability to use your well, your water well, as a source of differential to make sure that you can have, it will generate electricity using your well water and the difference in temperature there. It's called, there's a couple companies that do that. So there's ground source heat pumps where you're just using the difference in the air, the temperature of the earth and the air. There's water source heat pumps that use water. And then there is air source heat pumps that do the difference between the inside and the outside of your house. And they can be run on electricity. That way of making your house all electric brings you one huge benefit. You'll get air conditioning at the very same time, because the process that works to make it warmer can also be turned around and just reversed and make it also cooler in the home. It's magic. Well, actually, it's physics. And that physics principle has been known for a long time, but again, we had to get the electronics and the technology to meet the need. And so for that couple weeks in August when it gets really warm and you're a little uncomfortable and you got fans in every window, or you've got an air conditioner in the bedroom and an air conditioner in the living room, you can get a heat pump to take care of those needs and be more comfortable in your home. And you don't have to have, in the wintertime with heat pumps, you don't have to have cold spots, because you're not trying to necessarily, it doesn't push the heat around in the same way that a furnace does. So that's a very high level look at heat pumps, but they're really, really important, and they're going to be coming. And that's something to watch out for when you're making the decision about what to do for where you live, is thinking about using a heat pump. And now, getting close to wrapping up here, this is a screenshot that I pulled down off of the Department of Defense. So again, I talked about physics business, politics. The Department of Defense is looking at how they can bring renewables into everything they do. It's seen as a national security issue with climate change, with the instability in some of the places where we source, particularly our gasoline. We want to think about how can we power ourselves and how can we have some resilience in the face of climate change that might mean that we have, the situations like what happened in Texas in February, where it got unusually cold. We have this climate extremes now, and people were really in trouble. And people got carbon monoxide poisoning from burning things in their home. And people, unfortunately, were burning their fences and their furniture to try to stay warm. That kind of crisis, the wildfires that happened in the West, those are the things that are really going to be threats to us going forward. And so it's encouraging to know that the Department of Defense is looking at these issues. And so finally, again, that notion that what we're going through in these big changes are about technology change that we've all lived through. Most of us have changed from having only land, many of us, I shouldn't say, I'm probably showing my age here. Many of us are having, sorry, I just was able to read the questions for the first time, so I'm going to be able to get to them in a minute. So this transition from a system that worked, that old phone worked for a long time, a good 100 years, but things reach their natural cycles and we move into new technologies, and sometimes it's a little bumpy along the way, certainly, as happens to me pretty regularly, but I think we want to be ready in the Upper Peninsula for what's coming. And to be ready for that, we need to start thinking about how are we going to take advantage of these new technologies. So I'm going to look at the questions. The question is, love the idea of placing renewables on brownfields. Is our infrastructure up to speed, though, in terms of storage and transmission of the renewable energy generated? What do we need to do to make that happen? So, the storage is a question of, they're still figuring out which technology is going to work best, and so there's still a lot of testing and piloting going on. But I think businesses and actually, the Department of Defense are really on the forefront of figuring out what works and what works at a larger scale. It's going to take understanding some chemistry. It's going to take being willing to do some experiments, honestly. So, and in terms of policy and looking at the changes that we need, the Midwest is starting to move into the question of how to handle battery storage on that whole grid scale, that big image of the grid that I talked about. And I can put you in touch with folks who are working on those questions. I think that as we work together and keep in mind that what we want to do is be able to generate locally and then store it locally, that this answer, we're working towards making it more and more possible. And then on the question of transmission of renewable energy, so that's a really interesting, I didn't even touch on some of the issues around how we've moved from having one giant plant to having the ability to generate power at a much more, instead of having 100 or the Presque Isle power plant here in Marquette, to make it real for locals, was a 300 megawatt plant. It could generate 300 megawatts. We now have the ability to put lots of little 50 or even 20 or 10 megawatts all over the place. And that's that ability to generate power. Now, of course, you got to put it in the right place where there's good sun or good wind. means that you don't have to always have such big transmission lines. That said, that's the ability to have local power, local solar, and allowing that the utilities would allow that power to come back onto the grid. That said, the middle of our country, the Dakotas, Kansas, Iowa, tremendous amounts of wind there. And in fact, Iowa is regularly generating 40% of their entire electrical needs based on wind alone in the state. So keeping their money local, keeping their taxes local. And we could take advantage of when they have excess, because we're in the middle of the country, we'll connect to that within our grid. That does mean running transmission lines. And to connect this all back together, there's now a move to put more transmission lines on the interstate highway system, because as we move into electric vehicles, and remember, we're going to have all electric vehicles in 15 years. The big semi-trucks and delivery vans need a lot of power to generate them, to move them around, I mean. And so we are looking at making sure that the utility corridors are the transportation corridors so that the need is right where the demand is. So a lot to think about, a lot to talk about. I'm going to finish by again thanking Campfire CoWorks and the Conservation Data Lab for helping make this possible today, and the terrific work to make the technology finally work today. And the Citizen Utility Board of Michigan, which advocates for residential ratepayers and issues that annual report comparing the reliability of our utilities as a way to help us all get what we pay for. And if you, I hope you would visit our web pages at cubofmichigan.org to learn more. And I'm Jenn Hill, and thank you very much.